thank you for inviting me, and I feel a little bit sort of, because I'm the humblest of all the speakers here. So you start with the sort of hors d'oeuvre, and he's saying no because he is British, and so we are all. No, I think you can hear me now, can't you? Yes. So first of all, I had forgotten I'd done all of those things, which is good to be reminded. I suppose when you get to my age and Joe Biden's age, if you like, you sort of forget about things you've done. It's all perfectly true, except I was not born in Denmark. My dad was born in Denmark, which is, and he would not claim to be that because he's from the German minority. But my parents actually were in what was known as Biafra at the time, part of Nigeria now, where there was an independence movement. And after that failed, we moved to Canada. So, and we lived close to the Quebec border. You can still hear me. The lady can't hear me. No, you can't hear me? Is that? So, okay, this is just feels a bit more like I'm calling out the bingo numbers when I've got this one. I won't be. Anyway, so I'll start all over again. So I'd forgotten all those things that you mentioned that I've done, but I said, you know, when you reach my age, you forget a lot of things. It was all perfectly accurate, apart from the fact that I was actually born in Biafra, or Nigeria as it is now, and then I grew up in Canada. So basically, the story of my life has been to be in places that wanted to become independent and not necessarily achieved it. I'm sorry to say this, but it's not necessarily an omen. My sort of first memory of politics was when the Québécois voted in a referendum, and I wrote a history essay aged 11, and my history teacher, Mr. Vamp, who rang my mother, saying that they were most concerned about Matt because he had advocated Québécois independence. And then being the defiant sort of person, I went on to do a doctorate on the subject of independence referendums, just so to prove my history teacher wrong. Now, I mean, you can be a defiant person if you like. Now, my talk today is based on a book which is called I Want to Break Free. And of course, there is a slight Barcelona reference here, which I'm sure some of you have spotted, because there was a man called Freddie Mercury who sung with Montserrat Caballé, I think, Caballé, Barcelona, and I can't quite do the singing there. The book has got that sort of theme, and for people, I know Andrew's the same boat as I, we actually do want to write books that are read by real people and not just the 12 people who write academic reviews. I wanted to reach out, I didn't just want to be free, if you like, I wanted to reach out to a broader audience and to see how we can make this a popular thing. Basically, throughout my academic career, I have been moonlighting in places where they want to become independent. I was in the Caucasus, that didn't go well either. I mean, it's a little bit of a problem actually. So I don't think I really know if I was the right person to invite here if people want to become independent. But you know, one thing has to sort of break that up. So I wanted the book to be a practical guide, really, which is the subtitle. And my editor said, well, you know, have it complete with Gantt charts so people know exactly what to do so that they can go on and establish an independent country. So it's a bit like, sort of like Jamie Oliver writes cookbooks so you learn how to do a recipe. I write the cookbook of independence, if you like. So if you read my book, which is available on Amazon for a reasonable price, I did grow up in North America, so I do want to sell things. You'd know how to do it. Now, my original title was based on an academic article I wrote, which I called the Neil Sedaka Theory of Politics, Breaking Up is Hard to Do. But my editor, who is younger than me, said nobody remembers Neil Sedaka and breaking up is hard to do. I think you do down there, but maybe we're sort of the same vintage. So we, it's the one, dumber you are, and that sort of thing. Anyway, so I wanted to, he said you should have a different title. He says this is about aspiration, and therefore why don't you go for the Freddie Mercury one, I Want to Break Free, because that's what it's really all about. And I will come into that in a second. Just, I have to say a small thing here, which has got nothing to do with this. But I was involved in the Scottish referendum on independence, and I actually always thought that was going to be much closer than people thought. And then I wrote an article, which was my sort of first foray into the pop references. And I said, David Cameron's strategy is a number of failures. David Cameron's a friend of mine, by the way. So we went to college together, and we are on good terms. He's a very, very, very nice man. Not necessarily a great politician, though, but he also once said to me that I was just a political scientist. Well, I am. Anyway, so anyway, I'd written this chapter about David Cameron, which I called The Britney Spears Theory of Politics. Oops, I did it again, which I think is quite good. And then Twitter had just started, so I had at Britney Spears, hashtag Britney Spears, oops, I did it again. And then one of my students came up to me and says, have you seen it? And I said, I don't know what I've seen. You have been retweeted by Britney. And so somebody in Britney Spears' team had retweeted me, which, of course, after that, everything is secondary. So, so I basically had to follow that, and there's no danger that Freddie Mercury, who is certainly no longer with us, will retweet me. But it became sort of a bit of a line that I would use this. Now, sort of coming into the substance of the book, there are, and you basically summarized my book better than I could myself, so it's kind of like you're a tough act to follow. But anyway, so the process of becoming independent is, I was about to quote Barbara Streisand, the road is narrow and long, but I won't, or I just did actually. Now, but it is not completely impossible. If we can take a slightly different reference, Mahatma Gandhi once said, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then you win. And I think that's the important thing about independence movements and people and countries that want to become independent is they always go through the stages of being ignored, being laughed at, and achieving what they want, except Biafra and other places. So it's not necessarily the case, but they often go through those stages, and then there will always be, this will be the end of the world, and if this country becomes independent, nothing will ever happen again, and nothing will happen. Now, I was reading the letters of Hammarskjöld, not the UN Secretary General, but his uncle, who was Prime Minister of Sweden. He was describing all the disasters and catastrophes that would happen if Norway became an independent country. Now, most people these days would not really see Norway as being naturally part of Sweden, nor would we consider Finland to be belonging to Russia. So a lot of places have become independent. We don't even see them as being a problem. Is it a problem that people from Iceland are no longer part of Denmark? I mean, the Danes were very upset about this in 1944. So countries can become independent without there being a number of disasters happening. We used to have only about 50 nations around the world about 100 or so years ago. Now we have nearly 200. And, lots of terrible things have happened, but not because these countries have become independent, they just have. Now, in divorce law, I was a lawyer previously, there used to be a thing, I think in Italy they say Italians don't get divorced, they just don't live together. And then you sort of accept it. So I don't know how it is in Catalonia, but I think in a mature society, if people no longer love each other, they get divorced and then they go on and they live happily apart ever after. And I think the same can happen with countries, but I'm sort of digressing just so because people sometimes say, well, why are you having these terrible things about sedition and countries becoming independent? It's terrible. Why? Maybe you're an intelligent man, and so on. So yeah, lots of intelligent people also believe in independence. So, or not. I mean, it is just that. But anyway, before you get to that, there are a number of things that have to happen. Now, and some of these things you already have done here. The first chapter of the book is called Start Me Up. Yes, there is a Rolling Stones reference there if you want to go into that. And most countries need to establish that thing that they have together. They have to have a culture and identify that. Now, sometimes they have to make it up from scratch. Again, when Italy became independent, they kind of sort of did it almost in reverse. There was a famous quote, now we've established Italy, we just have to create the Italians. Now, it's not entirely true because Italy had come into being They would go around in Italy and write graffitis on the wall because Italy becoming an independent country was considered to be very far out and very dangerous and, you know, the end of the world really. And people would go around, they would write Verdi, as in the opera composer. And Verdi was a fervent nationalist and believer in independence. Pensiero, you know, the choir of the Hebrews, and they always sing, which is basically a nationalist tune. And people would write Verdi on the wall, which wouldn't mean his name, but it would mean Victor Emanuele Re d'Italia, which you understand because it's relatively close to Catalan. And that was basically a statement of independence, but you have to create that movement. Now, that part of the book in Catalonia, or Catalonia, whatever I'm supposed to say here, is sort of done. I mean, you have a culture. So we move on to the next one. Now, the next chapter, and this is where it becomes slightly more difficult, is the legal aspect. I call it what's law got to do with it. Get it? Tina Turner, right? Okay. Not quite Tina Turner, that she didn't really dabble in law, but the important thing here, and in the law chapter of it, is that a number of factors that have to be met before you can have a referendum or you can consider to be an independent country in international law. You have to have a defined territory, you have to have defined population. That's the relatively easy part. But you also have to be in control of the territory. You have to be able to perform the functions of a state. So when you declare independence, or if a country declares independence, they need to basically be able to run their own affairs. And then fourthly, they cannot be a puppet state. They cannot be run by another country. So when there's a guy called Vladimir Putin who's making a lot of trouble at the moment, he creates little states every now and then, but they always 100% depend on money from Russia. So they're puppet states, and therefore in international law, they are not states because they also don't necessarily even control the territories there. Now I'm putting that out there because that's sort of like the boxes that you have to tick. And I think it may have been the boxes that weren't ticked when Declaration of Independence was issued here, but that's sort of like a different matter. It's known as the Estrada Doctrine. It was the Mexican foreign minister in the 1930s who came up with that, and that has been the part has been followed ever since. Now, I'm sort of rushing through a little bit because I only have 5 minutes left. And the important thing, though, about becoming independent is not just the legal issues. I mean, the legal issues are obviously important because you have to go by the book, but sometimes, you know, law can be quite sort of, let's say, flexible, and it's not really supposed to be flexible, and people would always say there is a process and the rule of law and all of that. Now, there is a process, but there's also a conflict. Most countries don't allow independence. But if you actually meet the Estrada Doctrine, then countries become independent anyway. There was no way really that Malta, by the way, I don't know if anybody here is familiar with the finer points of Maltese history. I'm not particularly, but I do know a couple of facts. So in 1955, there was a referendum in Malta on whether Malta should be fully integrated into the United Kingdom, have 3 members of Parliament that would be sent to the Westminster Parliament. And so that was established by referendum to basically be part of the UK. Then the British government didn't do, I mean, I'm paraphrasing and summarising somewhat, they didn't really do much about it. So in 1964, the Maltese had a referendum on the Constitution. They barely won that referendum, not by a large majority, this is important actually, not by a large majority, but they barely won this referendum, and they in a way that referendum was unconstitutional. There was no way of doing it. There was no thing that allowed Malta to have a referendum on independence, so they had it on the Constitution, but it was basically a referendum on independence. The British government and the British Parliament voted to allow Malta to become independent because you can't stand in the way of the incoming tide, if you like. So because at the time Malta had a defined population, a defined territory, they were in control of the territory and they weren't a puppet. They met the Estrada Doctrine, therefore they were ipso facto. Well, that's not very sort of pop reference to say ipso facto, is it? Anyway, my dad was a Latin teacher, so I'm going to get away with it, I guess. So they would ipso facto an independent country. So it is important to do that, but that's the law of it. The politics of it is always to find, you know, friends that will that will support you. And that's where it always comes down to. You need to find the people who will basically support your independence. You need to find out who your enemies' enemies are. And that is always a tricky bit. And I don't want to sort of go into details about that because that is I don't have a simple answer to that. But that's where you have to become Machiavellian. I do think Machiavelli was an interesting writer, and I'll come back to him just shortly because I'm almost done now. Now, the next chapter is called Shake Your Moneymaker. This is a more reference that, I mean, you look like you know your music down there, so I've just sort of singled you out. But Shake Your Moneymaker is really Charles, of course, and it's sort of the more, if you like, this is the more spirited part of it. Now, in economics, most countries take a knock when they become independent. It is a thing that costs you money. I think Montenegro actually got money, and I think, I'm not quite sure about Slovenia. I think you became slightly richer, but that's, I won't go into detail about that, but you certainly wasn't a disaster. So it can be a bit costly to become independent. That's also costly for countries that leave the European Union, by the way, but leave that as it is. Now that's sort of on the negative side of it, but there's also the positive side of it, which is, and I tell the story in my book, which is when you become an independent country, you actually don't have to pay the debt of the country that you're leaving. And so if Scotland had become an independent country, they could just have sent the bill to the British government. Now, that will have a number of implications, but I met with Nicola Sturgeon, who was at the time Deputy First Minister, and she said to me, and I won't try to do the Scottish accent, she says, does that mean that if we vote for independence, we just send the bill to David Cameron? And I said, yes, basically. And she says, would you like to write an article in The Sun about that? And so I did write an article in The Sun about it. So basically, when you become an independent country, you send the bill to the country that you left. There was supposed to be a UN convention, but that was never ratified. So if Catalonia becomes independent, you can send the bill to Madrid, which may be why they said yesterday there couldn't be a referendum. But it's just a small and interesting little legal matter. When Ireland became independent from Britain, I've been told by a guy called Bertie Ahern, who used to be the Taoiseach or Prime Minister of Ireland, he said, we sent them £1. Because Britain thought Ireland thought they should be generous to Britain, so they would pay part of the debt after the First World War, which was £1. Even with inflation taken into account, that wasn't much of a contribution, but it's nice of them anyway. When Belgium became independent, they established this doctrine. They didn't never send any money to the Dutch, and so on. Ukraine, actually, when they became an independent country, remember they had a referendum. Now we're basically fighting for a country that wasn't supposed to be necessarily independent. They are, and that's good that they are, in my opinion. They actually wouldn't pay the Soviet debt. And then the bank said, well, in that case, we won't lend you any money, and they were forced to do it. So, there are realities on the ground, but the legal position is that you can basically send the bill to, I have no idea who the finance minister at the moment is in Spain, because it's sort of like, well, it's still the socialist one. So I've said a number of sort of slightly frivolous things about Freddie Mercury and Tina Turner and Britney Spears even. So I will end on a slightly higher note, a more intellectual note. And as I was traveling over here, I'm currently based in Australia, and it is quite a long trip, I read the entirety of Fichte's book, Fichte, German philosopher, Addresses to the German Nation. And he said, in order to become an independent nation, they just lost to Napoleon on the battlefield, and it was, they weren't. Basically, there wasn't really a Germany at the time. He says the only and important thing to start with is hope. If you don't have hope and aspiration, you can get nowhere. Hoffnung is the German word, which has got this sort of wonderful feel of Hoffnung. You even say Hoffnung, sort of with deep sense. But you have to have this Hoffnung, or hope, or espoir, if you have the French one, I suppose, in order to get anywhere. And I think that is important. Interestingly also in Fichte's book, and I sound like a university professor, which is really my job, is that Fichte's book is based around Machiavelli. So Fichte Also, I compared himself to Machiavelli, which makes me slightly problematic that I have done it too, you know, but presumptuous. You even said that. You actually sort of, you were being a bit sort of, you were correct. So it is very cheeky of me to compare myself to Machiavelli. But Machiavelli, when he wrote his book, The Prince, or Il Principe, what is it in Catalan? Prince, okay, so it's the same. That book was not just about being cynical and being realistic about it. It was a book that was intended to create an Italian nation. Now it took 400 years, and that's not necessarily helpful. But that book is a nationalist book. It is a book by an aspiring Italian nationalist, somebody who wants to create a nation out of this people that has the same language roughly, and so on. And in the book he says there are two factors in life. There is fate and there is virtù, which is the Italian word for virtue. And he says, fate can sort of knock you over. And he says sometimes the storm comes in and all the water floods you and people are drowning, and that is terrible. And that if you just sort of stand back and allow fate to do that, then you will be overwhelmed. But if you have virtù, then, which means that you have sort of, it's a bit like the Jewish words or Hebrew word chutzpah, or ballsiness, and being sort of like stand up and come at me. And it's like preparing for that. And he says, we know that the storm is going to come, but then create canals so you actually get the water in from the sea, and it can irrigate the lands, and you can actually make use of the water. So instead of being overwhelmed, if you take matters into your own hand, if you actually have virtù, which is then is defined as the ability to have sort of, virtuosity, that you can sort of, perform like a really good performer. If you use that virtù, you can actually subdue fate. And Machiavelli, in sort of slightly sexist language, then go on to say that virtù è una donna, like fortune is a virtue, is a woman, and you have to sort of hold her down. It's slightly problematic there, Machiavelli, but we won't go into the details of sexual politics in the Renaissance. But the point is basically that if you just accept fate as it is, then you will never win. But if you actually try to sort of stand up to fate and think about it, then you can actually use those forces of nature to create the country that you want to create. And on that Machiavellian note, I will finish, and I'll allow you to have questions. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Qvortrup, for your insightful remarks. I'd like to dig in some of the issues you mentioned, and also to move more to the specific case of Catalonia. It's good that you end up with fate and the floods. So, because now in the last few years, with the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, it seems that the world has become harder, and things began to look a little bit grimmer for state designations. So, in this global context, how do you see the prospects for self-determination movements now in comparison for like maybe 10, 20 years ago, and how do you see it like now and also in the near future?
Right, well, I'll sit down and answer that, and thanks for the questions. Actually, I think implied in your question is now it becomes much more difficult and people are focusing on many other things. I did another book which was called Referendums and Ethnic Conflict. But I think the massive royalty check I got from that book was £5 altogether, so it didn't sell particularly well. So maybe that's an indication of the book. But I did a statistical analysis, and I found that most countries have become independent in times of upheaval, in times where everything is in flux. So there was a massive rush of states, statistically speaking, after the First World War, after the Second World War, and of course after the fall of communism. So I think if we sort of look at the overall things, countries come into being at times when people think it can only get better. We need to have a radical new departure. So I would say that having a period of crisis is possibly a good thing for countries that want to become independent.
Thank you so much. So Let's move to Catalonia's experience in 2017. So, what could we learn from, according to your opinion, for our mistakes, especially when it comes to our foreign policy strategy during that time?
Yes, I think you could, and I think what happened there was a lot of sort of talking about the principles and the other democratic countries and so on. And I see that, I'm in Bougainville, which is part of Papua New Guinea. They had a referendum that was sponsored by the UN, and Papua New Guinea are now saying, well, you can't really go after all. And then they say, well, won't the Australians, because the Australians were the ones who were behind the peace agreement. They're a democratic country, what about the principles? And I say to them, look, have you ever read Machiavelli? And they look at me because he's not massively read in Papua New Guinea and Bougainville. And I said, well, basically the lesson here is that principles are important, but only once that, that the politics of the ground are established. There's a famous book by a political scientist called Sovereignty, and this book has a subtitle, Organized Hypocrisy. And these principles are organized hypocrisy in international law. What you need to establish if you want to become an independent country is you need to find friends in high places. I was woken up at 2 o'clock in the morning because a diplomat sent me a message saying that the Serbs have now amassed forces close to the Kosovan border, and that could become interesting. Now, first of all, it's interesting that an American diplomat sends me that message, because that shows that the people from Kosovo have friends in high places. They played to that, and that's what you need to do. And you can't just say, oh, the European Union believes in democracy and so on. They do that when all the other things, when it suits them, basically. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that's how politics works. So the lesson here is to find your friends' enemies and play that strategic game. And I think that wasn't quite what happened from my perspective at the time in 2017.
Thank you. So it's good you mentioned the European Union, because most of the international work of Catalonia during that time was very focused on the EU. So, you have been critical about that in the past. So, what do you think? How do you think Catalonia should approach its relation with the European Union and the European institutions?
Well, they have to start making a look as if it is absolutely important for the European Union to maintain that there is a Catalan independence. And I always, I've lived in Scotland for a long time. Previously, and the Scottish National Party used to have this the slogan, an independent Scotland in a united Europe, and I think I can't really see why you couldn't have an independent Catalonia in. I mean, that's going to be a tricky one. I'm not saying that's easy, and political issues on the ground are such as they are, but I think that the idea of the Europe of regions, the Europe of Europe, which is not just a Europe of nations, is probably the way forward. But that's going to take a lot of persuasion. But I think there are a number of places that aren't necessarily nations in the same way. I mean, it's interesting that Bavaria never ratified the German constitution. Bavaria is what is called Freistaat Bayern, the Free State of Bavaria. And then in some ways Bavaria is more Bavarian than German. There's nothing wrong with that, but they can also be, I rather like that actually, and my ancestors from Schleswig-Holstein, so we're not Germans, we're Schleswigians, but we could still be within that. Now currently that's part of Germany, but also part of the EU. So I think it's getting back to the free countries within a united Europe might be, and Europe of course has been united much more recently because of the war in Ukraine. But there's nothing wrong with having independent countries within that. That would be my. But whatever I say about that, people say it's naive, and it will be you might ignore you, they might laugh at you, and then you might win.
So, keeping thinking about France, in the past you have mentioned that the US and the UK could be some of these powerful friends in higher places for Catalonia. What do you think, so which interest do you think Catalonia can serve in this relationship?
Well, I don't know if I've necessarily said that sort of that Britain necessarily would be Catalonia's friend. I'm sort of thinking when I was born in Biafra, France had recognized Biafra as an independent country, not because the French particularly liked the Biafrans, but just they wanted to upset the British, and it was Charles de Gaulle was president at the time, and there might be that sort of upsetting people. And I think possibly the British might previously have wanted to do things just to upset the Europeans. I don't think that's on the cards at the moment. So I think the getting the Americans and the Brits to necessarily support you is not. I think that's probably not a forthcoming option. But it was interesting when I was in Canada at the time when I got in trouble with my history teacher for writing about Québécois independence. One of the things that René Lévesque, who was the first minister or the premier of Quebec at the time, did was that he actually traveled to the US to say, well, it wouldn't be a threat to America if we could have a free trade deal. So René Lévesque, who in my opinion was a great man, and so was Trudeau. He's not called Trudeau, by the way, he's called Trudeau. Just remember that. He's French, right? Trudeau, not Trudeau. I get very annoyed when I hear that. It's Trudeau. But he was very upset that the American diplomats would meet with René Lévesque. So the Québécois had done the groundwork. If they had won the referendum, they had already put feelers out to obviously to the French, but that's this obvious one, but mainly to America, because they needed to be realistic about it. And those diplomatic ties were already in place beforehand. And so I think the international politics of it is establishing those sort of contacts. And I think, I'd be interested to hear how. I know that Bosnia-Herzegovina was very good at that because they had a different situation than Slovenia did. But it is having those contacts with places where you have an interest, and you have to identify things that are of interest. In Bougainville at the moment, which is a case which is very close to my heart, and I'm there at the moment, there's saying that, look, the Chinese are circling around, it is possible we might just give them the concession to open a harbour here, and then suddenly the Americans are interested. And you have to sort of play those cards and be a bit cheeky about it. Now, there's nothing that having China as your friend is not really helpful. And a lot of countries became independent in the 60s, and then they had the Soviets as their friends, which was really not very helpful. But if you want to become independent, you need to sort of think very in a Machiavellian way about these things. And so I don't think Britain necessarily is a power that people will. The Europeans are not going to be bowled over by that. The Americans are a different proposition, but it's finding nations, powerful countries that would have it as their own interest to support you. And that's a tricky thing, and I can't tell you what those interests would be, but you have to do your homework on that one.
Well, finally, before giving the floor to the audience, what could be your 3 top advice for Catalonia and its quest for self-determination?
I remember there was John Major, who was Prime Minister of Britain, said that his priorities were education, education, and education, but he wasn't quite sure about the order of it. And I think my thing about independence here is, what is it? Basically the national interest of potential allies, and the national interest of potential allies is the most important thing. You need friends in high places to become independent. Norway became independent because the Swedes weren't happy about that at the time, and then they reached out to the Brits. And Norway was supposed to become a republic, and Christian Michelsen was supposed to be the president of Norway. And the Brits says, we don't particularly like the Swedes. You can become independent if you have a monarchy. And the Norwegians weren't happy about that, so they found a useless Danish prince and he became the King of Norway. And then the Brits supported Norway. Now at the time Britain had clout, probably still has to a degree, but that was just basically finding what would be in the national interest of the British. When Iceland became independent in 1944, the Danes were not very happy about it. The Icelandics then said, we have two options. Iceland at the time had the largest communist party in Western Europe, and they thought about contacting Stalin. They actually were in contact with Stalin, not because they wanted to join with him, but when the Americans heard about this, the Truman, just about coming into the Truman administration, said, could we have a landing strip there? Certainly you can. Iceland doesn't have an army, but they allowed the Americans to land their planes there on the way to Europe and could basically fly over to the Soviet Union. That was in the national interest of the Americans to help the Icelandics. So you need to look at the examples of Iceland and Norway and emulate those examples. And how you do this, that's up to you to do. I'm just saying that you're not going to be successful unless you can do that. But they could do that, and people laughed at them at the time, and they were successful.
Thank you so much. So now we are going to open this for Q&A. So if someone has questions, please raise your hand. Okay.
Thank you very much. Just regarding the acquisition of allies, what is the usual role?
Allies. Can you repeat, please?
Yeah, regarding the acquisition of allies,
Yes.
what is in the diplomatic process here? What is the usual role of private institutions and the non-usual, not the diplomatic, for example, structure that here we might have with the region and with the regional government of Catalonia? I'm thinking about research institutions, corporations, etc. What's the usual role you've seen that these kind of non-governmental, non-political institutions from the nation that plays here in making those friends?
Yes,
Yeah.
Yes, I think I go back to being the bingo host here again. It's always artificial, you know, it's because there wouldn't be technically a diplomatic service for these countries, but they do have one anyway. So it's all of the above. Anything goes. You know, it's the kind of things that you know, all the sort of non-formal ties that you have is, you know, all is fair in love and war and independence movements. And so you need to utilize the civil society as much as you utilize the other ones. I think in Norway, the most important group that was reached out, the ones that had all the contacts, were all the shipping magnates. And Norway had a lot of shipping. Mikkelsen, who was the Prime Minister at the time, who was also a great man, by the way, was a shipping magnate. And he knew a lot of British people because Britain is a seafaring nation. The people in Bergen in Norway are seafaring. So basically it was due to the contacts he had in shipping that he was able to reach out. So you use all the means available when you reach out to other people, and you have to do that because only one of them or few of them will be successful.
Good morning. You said right at the beginning that one of the easy things to do was defining population, and the consideration that the population would be the people who live in the territory, I imagine. In general, would there be exceptions to that? To people considered, in this case, Catalan, for example, people, Catalans living abroad? And then there's the consideration of 300 years of active policy from the Spanish state of bringing a large population of people who they have encouraged to never feel Catalan, never want to be Catalan. The question is, you know, what your thoughts on that?
I mean, that is a tricky issue because you often have people who have been brought in to, I mean, Ukraine is an interesting example of that. My son was a school teacher in Dnipropetrovsk, just on the Russian, towards the east of Ukraine, and he actually has a different job now because the house he used to live in is destroyed and his former landlord is dead, just to put it into perspective. But the interesting thing was, at the time when all of this happened, my son Sebastian, he's called, sort of a almost Catalan-like name, said that he came there. They would speak Russian in the house that he lived in. He would speak Russian with all the people he was around. But because Russia was behaving the way that Russia was behaving, a lot of people in Ukraine, even if they should ethnically be Russian, probably ethnically were Russian, felt themselves to be Ukrainian because there were principles of being a Ukrainian that were more important than the language and so on. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of Orluk. Orluk was, no, you wouldn't necessarily, but you can, somebody wrote an article, a British academic, i.e. me, and Orluk was a man who wrote a Ukrainian constitution in Russian, by the way, and he talks about the division of powers, having an elected legislature, an executive, an independent judiciary. So those ideas were considered to be fundamental Ukrainian. This is before Montesquieu, before the articles, the US, what's called the Madison and Federalist Papers and all of that. So those ideas about being Ukrainian have been adopted by people even if they were imported from Russia. So the key thing here is to make people feel that identity. Now, Zelensky speaks very bad Ukrainian. He speaks very good Russian. He speaks Russian. He's supposed to be like that. But there are principles that are more important. So the people who might have come in, I mean, it's a story of everywhere, that they become sort of integrated. Like the poor people from Iceland couldn't speak Icelandic. And then they discovered the sagas and so on. But you need to, you can't just sort of say like, you know, they're probably going to be important, they're not going to be with us. You have to create a thing that make them feel part of that. And if you have a very aggressive state that's sending tanks in and not allowing people to vote, and I'm not saying this in a speculative way because I was here in 2017, if you get that sort of people and you get that level of oppression, that you may speak physically or linguistically their language, but you may not agree with them. So you have to think about the people who now speak Russian, who think in Russian, but who are Ukrainians in Ukraine because their houses have been destroyed and their friends have been killed. Now, this is not Ukraine, I know, but there are things that are more important than those sort of ancient ties. And when you have that situation, you have a people. I think one of the Ukrainians says, to a people belong everybody who feels they are part of that people. I mean, that probably sounds better if you say it in their language, but you have to create that feeling of being part of a culture. And whether you then have ancestry, I mean, I've got ancestry all over the world, but I still support the English cricket team, and Andrew does too, and whether that's important or not, I don't know, but it's creating that feeling around being part of it. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, or Rousseau as we call him, the British, but not British, the Swiss or Genevan nationalist, was asked to write a constitution for Poland. And he didn't really answer the essay question. He says the only way Poland can be a nation is not by having institutions and all of that, it's to have a thing that you rally around. And Rousseau then says, just look at Spain. And he says, and there's a difference here, he says, would there be any Spain without bullfighting? Because they have to rally a thing. Of course, bullfighting is not allowed here, that's my point. But for the other parts that are Spain, they rally around a thing. They may not have a lot in common, but they do like their bullfighting. And sometimes it comes down to those sort of smaller things. So he says that the Russians and the Germans will swallow you up, but you have to have a thing that you can rally around. And then he goes into poetry and but also horse sportsmanship, because sport is a very good thing. I think you're relatively good at sport, but then poor Catalan women are kissed by Spanish men and things like that. I don't know, but yeah, that's a different example.
Morning. Thank you very much for your talk. I wanted to have your view on the involvement of the international organizations on referendum of independence around the world. So we've seen a few organized or co-sponsored by the UN, normally in places that are sort of a lesser geopolitical importance, right? So, but we've never, there's less knowledge around on how international organizations themselves, particularly UN, but not only, get involved or try to get involved in the governance or of these sorts of conflicts. What would you say would need to happen for the UN, or say, I guess the UN is the only possibility in this case, or the European Union, to be in a position in which it would want to be a mediator? So whenever, sort of, if Catalonia, or say a hypothetical wannabe state, would seek for those great powers to rally behind it or promote its referendum independence, do you think that the involvement of an international organization would be a favorable thing that we would want to seek for, or would it be a channel, say, for others to intervene it or to water down or so? I don't know, what's your thought, having seen the UN referendums in the Pacific and so on? Thank you.
I think it's sort of several layered questions there. It's not because the UN is some of its part, really. I think when you have a proper referendum on independence, the UN, I don't. Can you hear me? Okay. The UN will be there to monitor the rules, and it could also be the Organization of American States if it's in Latin America, for example. It could be the OSCE is a credible organization in that way, and it is important that you have a neutral body that monitors that, as was the case in East Timor, as was the case in Eritrea. Not that it was very nice afterwards, as was the case when I helped design the rules in Sudan with as part of the American team, but then the UN also came in afterwards. But I think the sequencing in Sudan, and indeed in Bougainville and Papua New Guinea, was that there was first an agreement with an international monitor, and then once there's an agreement, the UN then comes in and makes sure that the rules of the game are observed, that there is parity, that there's no disinformation, which is difficult, that no side has more money, all those sort of things that make a credible referendum. So I think it's absolutely essential that the UN or a similar body observes these referendums once that they are there. I mean, I think in Bosnia there were referendums on all sorts of things, and then there's referendum on whether that should become independent, and then they want to be independent of that, and it sort of ends up in a farce situation. I was at the, and just as a kind of as an aside, the referendums can be a bit of a joke sometimes if they're not properly done. And I was doing a bit of work for OSCE, which was completely informal, so just as a fact-finding mission in what was Abkhazia, part of Georgia, and they had a referendum, fake one, I would say. And we were traveling around, and me and my American colleague was supposed to see these things, and my American colleague had eaten rather too much of the local food, which had an impact on him, so he had to go to the toilet all the time. So he was rushing into this place to go to the toilet, and he comes out very sort of disturbed with a piece of paper, and he says, "Have you seen this? It says something in Russian. I think it says da, that means yes. So it's a ballot paper." He says, "They're using this for toilet paper." And then I asked the interpreter, I said, "What's that?" And the interpreter says in this sort of sign of Russian-like accent, says, "Yes, it says da, because we printed too many." And of course they'd done, right, so they had 150% in favour, and then obviously that was a problem. So if we have these referendums that aren't monitored, this was monitored by nobody basically. So these referendums can be quite sort of fake. So you need to make sure that you have international credible monitors who don't just have a fake referendum where literally the ballot papers are used as toilet papers afterwards.
Yeah. So thank you. I wanted to ask you, because we don't have a lack of people writing constitutions here, precisely. We have a bunch of that. But we don't have an army. And you mentioned Ukraine. I don't know what would have happened with Ukraine if they didn't have the Americans behind them, if they didn't have their own army. So yeah, a lot of ethnically Spanish people could side with Catalonia if the Spanish state were to roll in the tanks, as you mentioned. But how long can a society hold a referendum or an independence bid with a regular army against, let's say, 300,000 mobilized citizens, but without any weapons, any support from the international community per se? Is that in the book?
Yeah, well, that's, in some ways, that's a military question. I mean, that's sort of like Andrew probably put better if you. So I'll defer that one. But a lot of places don't have armies to begin with. Norway didn't have an army to begin with. Iceland still does not have an army, so I think that's a different question in some ways. How long can you hold out? And there's all these sort of wonderful stories about the Civil War here, and I think it was Timothy, one of the Americans who wrote about it, says we had the best songs, and then all these sort of songs about in books. Hans Markus Enzensberger, a German writer, wrote about the short summer of anarchy and then Catalonia and all of that. That's very romantic, but it doesn't win wars. I think just sort of coming back to basically your question, because you started by saying we don't have anybody here writing a constitution. Well, you do? Well, that's good. Okay, because I was just... Well, that's good. Then in a way, I'm superfluous. Because I would say start by doing that. I mean, that's, Ukrainians can rally around a constitution that was written in 1713, I think, and which is the statement of Ukraineness, which is to believe in these institutions. And you need to have that sort of thing you can rally around, and then maybe have a referendum of that particular constitution, which is what the Maltese had, and then they became independent. I mean, also think about India. I mean, I do have my problems with India currently, because I think it's less democratic than it used to be. But I don't think India had much of an army in 1948. I think that wasn't the point. But they won after being laughed at and ignored. And that was only a few years after Churchill had said India is not a country, it's more a geographical response, it's more a geographical expression like the equator. I mean, that's pretty much a put down. And I think it's creating that. I mean, creating a constitution, and there's a whole chapter in my book about it, because creating a constitution is not just, it is also about the rules of the game and the practicalities and to, what is a contract and what is a people and what's human rights and so on. But it's also an expression of a thing you rally around. And the Germans have this wonderful word about Verfassungspatriotismus, constitutional patriotism, which they summed up as being sort of the idea of a thing that the new Germany can rally around, because Germany has a pretty problematic history if they just have it as history. And Dorf Sternberger said the essence of German constitutional patriotism is that there will always be an element of institutionalized grumpiness in the people, because grumpiness keeps people alive and you're not happy with the government. That's the sort of the idea of German democracy, is that people are always a little bit unhappy about what it is, and then you get rid of the government, you get a new government in. Now, if the Germans can sort of rally around institutional grumpiness, then maybe you can rally around another thing too. And maybe that's what you need to have, because people seem to complain here all the time about everything. Something like that. But write that constitution and make it a thing that people can rally around. Say, well, what is it that you want? And then make it about that. So, yes, constitution writing. More constitutional lawyers, fewer army people, because in the end, you don't win by... that was Rousseau's point about the Polish. You can't beat them on the battlefield, but you can beat them in the field of ideas, not necessarily just ideas. That sort of feeling of belonging and feeling of I'm part of this endeavour, and that's the thing you can't stand in the way of. The lady there.
Hi, good morning. You've mentioned earlier that for a country to become independent, there's a legal aspect relating to the control of the territory and also knowing your population. And here in Catalonia, I think that there's a tricky thing about it because we no longer know what a Catalan person means. I mean, the definition of Catalan person has been modified these years. And, well, do you think for a referendum or a self-determination process, we should use the Spanish census of what a Catalan person is, which is the habitant of Catalonia? But maybe you don't have any traditions, you don't speak the language, you don't believe in these Catalonian principles? Or do you think Catalonians should make a census of its population? How this should be done? Thank you.
Yes, and I think I was reading a book by a foreign person here, but a Spanish guy called José Ortega y Gasset, who wrote a book that's called The Rebellion of the Masses. And he has a small section there about some of these issues, and it says in most democracies the most important things are not the big principles, but it's all the technical details. And you very much are making a José Ortega y Gasset-like point. And the smaller details, such as the census, are obviously very important. And I think it's important that you don't make it more difficult for yourself than it actually is. So you would have, like in Scotland, they knew that the people who were most likely to vote for Scottish independence were foreign people living there. The majority of the Polish people who live in Scotland voted for Scottish independence. The only foreign group that voted against Scottish independence was the English people living there. So, you know, a little aspect there that it's not totally unimportant. I think in the Scottish case, I think obviously they'd thought about that, but the opinion polls that were indicating that the Sikhs and the Poles and so on who live in Scotland were more nationalist and the other ones was pretty flimsy. And I think what they did in Scotland was they said, well, we have a relatively good idea of how many people live here, and everybody who is registered essentially with a GP, because not everybody claims social security, but everybody in Scotland would be registered with a general practitioner, with a doctor. And that's a pretty good indication of who is there, because we would know how many of these people are over 18, or over 16, as the case was, and then they just use that, and that's well, but that's always the demos and the ethnos. But in democracies, it's not people who are ethnically of that group; it is people who are, as individuals, as persons living in that territory. So you have to ask all of those people, and here. A similar thing might work. I think you have public healthcare system here of sorts anyway. So just everybody who's registered to be able to go to hospital to enjoy that service, or to go to a doctor, should be allowed to vote. So, you know, what is good for the human body is also good for the body politic. So go with that. Don't start, you know, creating a census and going around and all of that. That's just going to be a waste of money. You want the people, and you want the people to know. Or you want to know what the people think, whether they're in favour of it or they're not in favour of it. That's for you to campaign for. That's politics again. But just be pragmatic, I would say.
Hi. What I was wanting to ask, and I think what she was asking, is we don't have a problem for counting people, but we are using Spanish laws and census. So any Spaniard who moves here in a few weeks is able to vote for Catalan Parliament, and that's the source of the problem. So there are movements who tend to make different census according to who was born here or your parents were born, and of course Spaniards think that's akin to ethnic cleansing or genocide or a gross manipulation. And I would like to know your opinion according to international law, or how could it be seen internationally? The fact of doing what Baltic countries did, which is we only count ourselves to vote, and we don't let Russians vote for our.
Yeah, no, I think you may not agree with me, but I think the general rule would be, and I can use the British example again. I'll use two examples actually. When Norway became independent in 1904, it was 99% of the people who lived in Norway who voted for that. Now the Norwegian parliament at the time had two parties. One was called left, one was called right, which was very simple. One was right and left. And the right-wing party was the Swedish party. They liked the Swedes. They were more sort of... and yet those people, some of them were even ethnically probably Swedish, but they were, became convinced that Norway was their home. And now it's just the Conservative Party in Norway is just called right. And it's got nothing to do with Sweden anymore. So it probably was at the time. And there were people who were coming in. But it was never a question in Norway of saying who's got... It was simple in Norway, by the way, in Scandinavia. If your name ends in S-E-N, like Jensen, then you're Norwegian or Danish. Or if it ends in S-O-N, then you're Swedish. So you can pretty much see who's Swedish and who's Norwegian. But it made no difference. And the Norwegians did not distinguish between the Hansons and the Hansens. And you're allowed to vote. So in international law, whether you are coming into the country as an immigrant or not is not a matter. If you exclude the Spanish, ethnically Spanish, from the referendum will never be recognized anywhere. And that's right and just, I think, personally. I think if the English people living in Scotland were not allowed to vote in the Scottish referendum, it would have been supremely undemocratic. So whether these people come in and they are ethnically Spanish and so on, it's just going to create sort of anger and so on. Now, I know that you have New Caledonia and the Kanaks and French have moved people out there to become, essentially French, and then Macron can say we have a referendum every now and then, they just vote no. And I think New Caledonia is a problem, but you couldn't just sort of say, well, every French immigrant can't. I mean, the French have probably been a little bit cheeky, to put it very mildly, and they have moved people over there. But I think the thing here, and then the Russians did the same with Ukraine, at least back in Soviet times, so maybe the Soviets did. But then it is just winning them over. So if people, it's not as if I think the issue was also mentioned in Canada at the time. And Périsseau, who was the leader of the Québécois nationalist movement, after the referendum was lost, say, well, it was mainly because English-speaking people in Montreal had voted for unity and not against secession. When he said that, it basically meant that people were saying, well, then you're not really abiding by democracy. And there are a lot of people, when I lived in Canada, I'm an Anglo speaker. My French is not particularly good. I can't speak with a Quebecois accent. But I would have voted for Quebec independence even if I'm technically not one of theirs, because I think I do like the idea of, in those days there was smoking Gauloise in the bars in Montreal, not Montreal, Montreal, please. And you can still have that feeling of that. So excluding people just because they happen to have a Spanish surname or be ethnically Spanish as such is an old-fashioned type of nationalism. There is the sort of the German nationalism as opposed to well, there's a kind of thing called ethnic nationalism and civic nationalism. And ethnic nationalism is the German type of Blut und Boden. If you're born there and you have a German name, then you're German. And then there's a civic nationalism, which is everybody who believes in certain principles can be part of that country. So Scottish nationalism is not having a Macpherson or any kind of other Mac name. It's about believing in the principles that are Scottish. And Scotland has a distinct legal tradition which is different from the English legal tradition. There's a whole way of thinking which is Scottish, and then you have to make that attractive to people. And I think a lot of people who would come from, I don't know, Andalusia or Galicia or what do I know, could probably be attracted to the way of life and the way of thinking that is Catalan. And then you have to make it welcoming, but excluding a certain group of people from voting just because they're part of that is a thing that will be frowned upon, and rightly so. Democracy is called democracy, not ethnocracy. Ethnos is that old-fashioned thing about certain sort of blood ties and what have you. But democracy is the rule of the people, and democracy is not about having a particular surname or ancestry. It's about believing in principles of equality, and in Fichte's book he says that the fundamental thing about any nation is it has to be started on popularity and humanity. And I think it should be popularity, that things are popular, and also in accordance with human dignity and so on. And human dignity means that everybody should be involved in shaping their own destiny.
I can just pick up. I was wondering. Thank you. I was wondering in your professional experience advising referendums, one of the things that we see is that, of course, referendums are sometimes lost because, amongst other things, probably people is afraid of the consequences, right? Afraid of that economic downturn or afraid of political instability at large. But one of the larger things that we feel people might be afraid of is war, right? Or military intervention or any sort of being confronted with that, especially in places which generate for generations or for some generations, people haven't experienced that context. So I was wondering, what do you think has changed, or how are referendums that are done in context of having been through a war recently, are they any different than referendums done in peaceful context, right? How do people vote differently on those occasions, or do they relate to this possibility differently? How does the war context changes things in this process? Thank you.
It's interesting with referendums get a bad name. I think there was going to be a referendum in Venezuela on the border with Guyana, and Maduro says, no, we're going to have a referendum. And the Organization of American States this week said that referendums are always abused. And then they had this long thing against referendums, and I felt quite upset about it. And I thought that calls for me to intervene. And anyway, and then one of the things they said was referendums often leads to more instability and war. I'm yet to see one referendum that actually there is in Bosnia, I think, but then there was war already there. When you had the referendum in Slovenia, that was the end of the matter in a way. You weren't at war at the time. I'll go into detail about that, but referendums basically are there at the end of things. Referendums are brutal things. There is an argument there, and there will be fake news, and people will exaggerate, and they will use fear and so on, but they use it in the context of a democratic contest. I think referendums, by and large, are I was about to sort of turn Clausewitz around, is the continuation of war by other means. And it's a way of you're turning from ballots to bullets. It doesn't mean that it's less passionate. It doesn't mean that there's less anger about it. But the anger that is normally plays out in the battlefield plays out at the ballot box. So if you lose a referendum or if you win a referendum, that's, I think historically every referendum I've ever been involved in has been lost. Whether it's changing the electoral system in Britain or Scotland or Quebec or Brexit or whatever. So I don't have, but I still, when people say, oh, do you think Britain will join the European Union again? I said, no, because the people have spoken, and with a small majority, but that's it. And that's just, that was a brutal campaign. But that hasn't led to war. It's like, then you get over it and then you say, okay, I lost, and we move on to the next one. And I think that's what referendums, brutal as they are, imperfect as they are a way of solving problems without actually getting involved in war. And yes, sometimes there can be violence associated with that. But in Scotland we had, and people were saying referendums lead to such discord. And in Scotland, one egg was thrown. One egg, and I think it hit a Labour politician. I mean, in Brexit there was a politician who was murdered as a result of that. That is very problematic. And Mr. Farage came out and said not a single shot was fired. Well, shots were fired, somebody died. Brexit was not a pleasant experience, but it was an experience that was, I think a lot of people, I don't know where you stand on the thing, Andrew, but that in a way it's not important. We had a civilized process that went through a parliamentary process. There was a referendum, and people say there should never have been a referendum in the first place. Well, of course there should be a referendum in the first place, because it turned out that people did not want to be part of the European Union, and then we're not, and then that has a number of consequences. But also a lot of sort of fear-mongering was used during that campaign. And Brexit probably hasn't led to economic benefits, but it also has not led to complete and utter disaster. Britain is still standing just about, and we know we're probably okay. We're probably moderately poorer than we were, but it's not as if we've got sort of soup kitchens in Surrey where I live or anything like that. There was a referendum. It did not lead to war or anything like that. If Scotland had voted for independence, it's not as if the Brits would have rolled in the tanks. They would we've had a process of how we're going to do this in practice. It's not as if the Canadians would have, would have rolled in. I don't know, the mounted police or whatever would sort of charged at institutions in Montreal and Quebec and so on.
The Nigerians did.
Well, Nigeria is a slightly different place. Also, there was not a referendum in Biafra before they became independent. Maybe they should have had a monitored referendum in Biafra, and maybe it would have been a different story altogether. So if you compare Spain to Nigeria, then we're in slightly different territory. I don't think that the Spanish...
You can certainly not compare to Canada either.
I think they would aspire to that, and I think you also need to aspire to people's better nature. If the Sudanese can, which is certainly not a country with an unblemished record of democratic governance, if they're able to have a referendum that is broadly credible, then another country beginning with S should probably aspire to that too. But if you want to aspire to be, like Azerbaijan with a Freedom House score of 7, which is the same as North Korea, basically not freedom at all. If you want to aspire to be in that company, I think there was a Spanish writer who said, tell me the friends you have and I'll tell you whom you are. I think it's called Cervantes something. It's quite famous at the time. And I think Cervantes' principles would be the one that the Spanish government would be susceptible to. But I'm a person who's written a book about independence movements. They're probably not going to listen to me anyway.
Yes, many of the last questions were that many people have made were about the fact that here in Catalonia, the independence movement has a support of, in every elections or referendum, it has a support of 40, 50%, maybe a bit higher, but when it has to vote in an election or referendum, the support stays a bit in these percentages, a bit similar to Scotland or Quebec. So for me, it's a very similar. You can make a lot of good comparisons. But it's just like that. It's an independence movement who stays in a percentage that if there is a normal or legal referendum, it may well lose or win the referendum by very small margins. And an independence movement who has this kind of support can be able to actually achieve independence if it really needs maybe 60–70% support, because this is really the situation in Catalonia. And you have said that that a good idea is to rally people, right, in ideas or ideals that are more collective than language, for example. But this takes a lot of time, but decades. So what can an independence movement do in this situation?
Yes, I mean, first of all, the thing about democracy is that democracy is you have to convince people, and you know, people say it's a forceless force is a better argument. That's very sort of idealistic to look at it like that, but that's essentially the way it is. When the Scottish National Party, no, they're not the Nationalist Party, they get very upset if you call them nationalists, they're the National Party. When they started the referendum campaign, they won 28% support for independence and they got 44%. So the SNP, Scottish National Party, lost the referendum, but they won the campaign. But they didn't achieve a majority. Now, if you want to, a lot of independence movements have started on lower levels of support. That was the case in Iceland, and I was when I was a postdoc in the late 90s, I was looking at some of the sort of indications. I know people in Iceland said, well, we can never be independent because we're too small and we're all of these things. And then suddenly when they had the referendum, there was massive support for it. But that's because there's an argument for that. So whether you have 40% in the polls at one stage does not mean you'd always have that. Then you have to convince more people. And you know, it is possible that you just don't win. I mean, it's nothing sort of, you know, written in the stars that Catalonia will be independent, but it could be independent if you are able to convince people that it is the right thing to do. Now, lots of opinion polls about Brexit, for example, if I can use, I mean, Brexit wasn't an independence referendum, even if people see it as that. And my old friend David Cameron, when he had the referendum, I sort of offered my advice, having been involved in referendums. He said, we don't need that because we were going to win this anyway. And that's why he said that I was just a political scientist. Now, I said, well, there are a number of things that sort of, you know, make it more likely that you will win a referendum. And you have to time it, and basically your timing is wrong. You will lose this one. I said, And so what you have to where you have to fight a referendum, you have to look at when a referendum is typically won. What are the things, the conditions that are necessary for winning a referendum, which is, you know, there's a whole long list and there's a literature on that, and there are, you know, things that, tricks that you have to learn. But if you only have 40% of the population and you want to exclude the people who are born in Spain and so on, then it's not going to happen. If you want to have a referendum, then you have to have it in the sort of spirit of, I am not afraid of the people. I'm willing to go up and say, these are my principles. Vote for this as a positive proposition. If you then lose, then I mean, Donald Trump, I think, was saying that if I lose the election, I won't accept it. Now, you don't want to be like that, not that I should have a go at Mr. Trump. That's too easy in a way. If you only have 40% and you're stuck at 40%, well, maybe it's just because people who live in Catalonia, including a lot of people who might be Catalans, just don't want it. But if I'm assuming you want Catalan independence, I don't know what your politics are. But if you do that, then you have to make it a credible proposition. And I think the Greeks, who had some experience with democracy 2,500 years ago, saying to win an argument, you have to have passion, credibility, and a logical argument. Ethos, logos, and pathos was how Aristotle put it, so no longer Freddie Mercury. But Aristotle's principles are basically the same. You need to have speak with credibility. You need to be somebody who say, well, actually, I know what I'm talking about. You will listen to me. You then have to have a logical argument that makes sense. It doesn't have to be fancy and detailed, but people say, well, actually, I can see that point. And then you have to have the passion to go with it. The British Brexit referendum had all of those things. You had credible people who'd been cabinet ministers. They had an understandable proposition saying we're no longer part of the European Union, we don't have to pay into it. There was a credible theory, and they had the passion. People who were against Brexit, who didn't want people to vote for Brexit, did not have a lot of passion. They were just sort of thinking, this is just going to happen and people will. They didn't really bother with a proper credible theory that everybody could understand. So they didn't have that one. And then you fielded people who were, I think David Beckham came out against Brexit. And you can see, David Beckham is okay on free kicks, and he says he will be David Beckham basically doesn't open that part of his mouth when he talks, and there'll be serious monetary consequences of voting for Brexit. I can't quite do the David Beckham accent. But David Beckham is not necessarily a credible spokesperson. They also had, and I won't try to imitate his voice, Stephen Hawking came out against Brexit. And you might know a lot about, I don't know, big bangs and black holes and what have you, but that doesn't mean that you become a credible spokesperson. So the people who were against Brexit did not have credibility, they did not have a rational argument, and did not have passion. Brexit worked because Farage and all of those people were true to the theories put forward by Aristotle. I don't necessarily know that Nigel Farage has been a great and avid reader of Aristotle, but if you want to succeed, you might take a cue from the Freddie Mercury theory that I proposed, but you should be more going back to the basic principles of ancient Greek democracy: ethos, logos, and pathos. A rational argument, credible spokespeople, and passion.
Yeah, we are going to do the last two questions. So, Victor and
okay. Yeah. Hi again. You were here on 2017. You mentioned, and that referendum came after many years of the Catalan politicians trying to agree on a referendum in Spain, right? Even though self-determination is not something that you should ask permission for. It is your right, so you go and act on that right. In any case, there's politics involved, and you want recognition from, ideally, right, from the country you're seceding from. The only reason why there was a referendum in 2017 was because no negotiations in that sense fructified, right? And that referendum, if you were here, I don't know what your thoughts about it, but it was a great success, despite the boycott of all the no voters and the Spanish parties who are present in Catalonia, and of course of the violence. And I guess the only, or one of the main reasons, I would say the only reason why Catalonia today is not an independent nation is because of the threat of violence, of escalation of violence from the Spanish state, and a very, I would say, cowardly stance from the Catalan parties in not holding and not defending that referendum that they themselves said would be legally binding. Some years after, so nowadays, what is your opinion? Should the Catalans try to seek for a new referendum, like some of the Catalan parties are advocating for, knowing that probably that's my opinion here, trying to find a dignified way to lose so that it can carry on leading the country, because some of these referendums, if agreed with Spain, will be non-binding and will probably not be binary either. So they will have a third question in between, something like that. So do you think that it would be better for us to say, we already held the referendum in 2017, despite the violence, despite everything the Spanish state did, and that's the one that we should defend, and then it's the Catalan parliament and the government's job to simply defend that, because the threat of violence will not disappear. Not now, not with a second or third referendum, so we're still in the same place, right? Or do you rather think that it is intelligence to somehow agree on something, even though that leads to probably losing it? And one of the reasons might be simply because there's a third option that divides the pro-Catalan independence voters, or, and I think that's one of the reasons why some of the people here talk about these census, is because we have seen, and I don't think it's, when they're proposing such ideas, it's not because a lack of democratic mindset, not at all. I think it is because we have been seeing in the past years a lot of immigration coming into Catalonia from many other places, not only Spain, and we do have the feeling, and maybe it's wrong, but we do have the feeling that there is a lot of strategy from Spain to say, if this ever happens again, we're going to have a stronger population from Spanish-speaking countries in the world, like South America, for example, who it will be easier for us to appeal to because it's the same language, and they sometimes don't learn Catalan when they come here because they don't find it useful for whatever reason. So there is a strategy behind this. So just to put some context on why people are starting to ask for this, because if we wait for 10 more years, and in those 10 years, Spain has, flooded the country with people who, with the same reasons France doesn't in Catalonia. So basically, what do you think is the most intelligent approach?
Right. I don't know if Spain is flooding you with people. I wouldn't know one way or the other. It's just the problem with conspiracy theories is that it requires a lot of competence on your part of your enemies, and whenever I hear about sort of slight conspiracies, if it is indeed a conspiracy, then conspiracy theories requires the people to be very competent. And my experience with public organizations is that they're basically not very competent. So even to organize logistically the influx of people in a system which is not completely Soviet would be tricky. I don't know. It's possible that they have that capacity. From my knowledge of the Spanish public service, level of administrative competence is not one that I would have thought would be capable of that operation, but that's just a separate matter. But I think even if people move into a particular country, then why was it that people who are Polish and live in Scotland want Scotland to become an independent country? Why is it that the Sikhs who live in Scotland now have a particular pattern of a tartan, which is for that clan of the Sikhs? Why is it that Scotland was able to appeal to people who are not born in Scotland to want to be part of an independent Scottish country? That's because they have a welcoming country. They were able to sell the idea of Scottishness. Now, personally, I didn't have a vote in Scotland. I sort of have, because I write about this, I thought it would have, I probably, if I lived there, I would probably have voted against it, probably. But that's, that's because I'm personally not necessarily convinced. But I think when you go and come back and say it was a massive success, I think it was 99% who voted for independence, but on a turnout of 42, I think. A lot of people boycotted it. It was a deliberate thing to boycott the referendum. So to say that, yes, we've already had a referendum, we can go back to that, and then your next question would have been, the people in Kosovo had a referendum in 1994, and then they didn't have a referendum, they became independent in 2008. The difference was that people in Kosovo had a high turnout. It wasn't boycotted, it was boycotted by certain Serbs, but it was still a considerable majority who had voted in 94 for independence from Kosovo from Serbia. So to go back to that particular referendum I don't think would work. What you need to find is you need to cozy up with people abroad. I mean, I was surprised to see, I think Mario Vargas Llosa, the Nobel Prize winning novelist who writes good books but who is pretty misguided when it comes to politics. And then suddenly he was in Spain fighting against Catalan independence. And I thought, I'm not even going to, I mean, his books are very good, it's just that his politics is very problematic and he doesn't frankly know more about politics than David Beckham knows about monetary and monetary union and that sort of thing. But you need to find people, that you need to appeal to people who have once escaped the clutches of Spanish tyranny, the people who are, why aren't you, talking to all of those people in Latin America? Why are you not talking to the Argentinians? It's not I spoke to an Argentinian person yesterday, and I don't speak Spanish or Catalan, I spoke in Italian to that person, so that's good because I feel more at home with somebody, because they don't necessarily feel Spanish. There's so many Italians in Argentina, they would understand it perfectly well. That's the kind of friends you have to look for, and then get them to put pressure on the Spaniards and so on. Just a bit of sort of judo, jiu-jitsu tactics. Don't fight them head on. Use their strength. That's Machiavelli would have used that example. Use their strength to make it your strength. And I'm sure that the Brazilians don't have a lot of love for the Spaniards, and that would be a very powerful nation to get involved. Use those sorts of people, and it's democracy is about winning the argument. The referendum in 2017 and the one a couple of years before and all of that. And you can say, well, self-determination of the people and all of that. Well, self-determination does not mean a right for independence. That's the basic international law, and that's a misconception of it. But if there is a proper will of independence, and you can get a majority for that, that's what you need to have. And then that's number one, and then you need to have friends in high places who will push for that. The most important thing, as I said before, my 3 takeaway points is to find friends in high places who can support you. And that's, so whenever you're talking next time to the president of Bolivia or whoever you're on your speed dial list, then say, oh, by the way, Catalan independence, and you're called Bolivia because Bolivar was against the Spanish tyranny, and then so appeal to the common history and appeal to that, and then and say, do you think that I don't know, Paraguay should be reintegrated into Spain? I mean, why not? And most of them would say, well, no. And no, why? Because they became independent of Spain at some stage. Mexico does not aspire to become part of Spain again, I don't think, last time I looked. And on the referendums, you said the thing about having various options. That is a thing that has been done in a few referendums. I know there's one more question that we have before I end up. In Puerto Rico, they occasionally have referendums, and they often have multi-option referendums, and that is actually an example of why they don't work. But in, I think, 1993, they had a referendum which was won by option 5, and option 5 was none of the above. Gentlemen.
Last question.
Sure. Yeah.
2 minutes max.
Okay.
Yeah. My question is pretty related to the previous one. It's just, are the referendums the only strategy? Because we already have one, and having a second one would be maybe pretty similar. What are the other options? Could we have, we already have majority of seats that are pro-independence. We don't have a majority of the votes. Could we start a process just with that, with the declaration on the parliament? Are there any other options besides the referendum, the parliament, or what's your opinion on that?
I was told here before that I had to have an answer in less than 2 minutes, and it will be less than 1 minute. If you want to become an independent country in this day and age, you must have a referendum. That's it. Sorry. A referendum allows people to vote for in a different way than they normally vote for in a political party. Alex Salmond, who was the leader of the Scottish National Party, toyed with the idea of Scotland just having a majority of the seats and all of that. That turned out not to be. That is not an option. A referendum is the only way, in a democratic country anyway, in a country aspiring to become democratic, to become independent. It allows the people to reject independence. It allows them to vote for that. But without a referendum, there will never be an independent Catalonia.
Yeah, thank you very much, Matt, and everyone for interesting questions. We will be finishing right now. Just to wrap up a bit, a couple of ideas I want to signal, no? Or to summarize some concepts that we consider might be interesting also for our case. And also connected with a reference that you made to the case of Ukraine, which is actually a very interesting and revealing one. I happen to know a bit familiar with that situation. I have had the chance to be 2 times in Ukraine this year, one in February, one in August. And what amazes me is the deepness and the dimension of the nationalization process through conflict, and actually through a collective exercise of self-defense for survival, you know? So linking it with some of the references that you made to the importance of culture and identity and language, as you know very well, Ukraine was quite divided country until 10 years ago in terms of geopolitical options, in terms of identity, in terms of self-awareness, in terms of language, in terms of understanding of what Ukraine was. This is a situation which is quite similar to what we have here today in Catalonia, unfortunately, you know, and some comments have been made on the majorities and on the minorities and on language and on, unfortunately, a growing, quite rapidly process of minorization, national minorization of Catalans within the Catalan territory. So I would like to close with 2 ideas. One is very related to this. It is about, it is really important to understand that conflict, it's probably a very useful political tool in order to precisely vindicate culture and identity and to work for the revival of a sort of a national idea, you know? Also through the rediscovery and reconciliation with the past, as you mentioned, including terms related to historical law and historical institutions, something that is effectively happened in Ukraine. You mentioned the case of Hetman Orlik in 1713. A few years ago, almost no one in Ukraine knew about him. Now, it's mainstream. The same happens with Melnitsky, Bandera, and Bandera. No, that's an unfortunate case, but yeah, Ivan Mazepa and others. So we had, of course, with all the differences, it's a very different scenario, of course, but we had the beginning of a sort of nationalization or national movement during 2017. We reached our peak in 2017, in October 2017. At the peak of our strength also, through conflict, you know? So yeah, just a bit to summarize and to reflect on the importance of this, with all the differences, of course it's a very different scenario, but conflict probably helps to make visible the situations of oppression, you know? Politically, but also when it comes to the linguistic dimension and to culture. And the last one, the last point that I would like to also to wrap up, it's and that you mentioned a couple of times, it's the importance of identification of the national interest of potential allies, and to try to understand the way they see us, not only in terms of values, but also in terms of their interest, and obviously in some cases appeal to the historical narratives that might coincide, for instance, in the case of Latin America. Having said this, we will be closing this first session. Thank you very much once again. It was a very interesting discussion. Thanks everyone for the questions. Now we have 20 minutes of break. In the 3rd floor, which you can access through this staircase, there is a room where we can have some catering. There will be some croissants and cafe and other stuff. So feel free to go there and have some chats and networking, as Michael mentioned at the beginning. And see you back here in 20 minutes for the 2nd session with former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Slovenia, Mr. Dimitar Robil. Thank you very much.